So let's get into the discussion about the two data collection mechanisms, primary or sources rather. But even before we proceed further, I request you all to bear in mind that when you look at any books or when you talk with the customers or when you appear for interviews, you might have different names for your output variable. Output variables are also called as response variables or dependent variables or regression, explained variables, criterion variables, measures variables, experimental variables, target, label, outcome. All these are the various names given to your output variable y. However, if you feel that I would not be interested to learn all of these things, at least a few, such as dependent variable, then target, label, outcome. These are a few terms that you might want to remember because we really don't know on what term people are going to use during interviews or during the client discussions. It is always good to understand these names. And when it comes to your input variables, they are given different names such as explanatory, predictor, independent variables, covariates, regressors, factors, carriers, control variables, so on and so forth. So these are a few things that I request you to remember. Predictor variables or inputs or factors or regressors. These are a few terms which are most widely used, so it always makes sense to internalize and start remembering those. When it comes to rows, you have different names like records, observations, cases, entries, entities, samples, examples, so on and so forth. These are the different terms given for your rows in the dataset. Then we also have columns. Columns are also columns are also called as features or variables. This is pretty simple. So try to remember these to the extent possible. At word go, you might not be able to remember everything, but whatever you can possibly remember, try to remember. Okay. So there are two data sources. One is primary data source, which includes surveys, experiments, interviews, focus groups, etc. It is costly to get the data. It is time consuming and you might get low quality data. However, you might get exact data needed for your analysis. And then we have secondary data sources. That is data which is already available. Okay. And there are three things that one has to remember. Secondary data source is easy and you get quick access to data. It is less costly. However, you might get irrelevant data sometimes. We will get to this discussion once again, but let us understand a few practical, use cases. We have worked for one of the telecom companies, and this telecom company was keen in launching 5G services. And they wanted to launch the 5G services in rural parts of the countryside. When we approached them, or when rather there was a mutual discussion which was going on, we checked with them on whether they have access to the data on who are the various customers, what kind of data plans, what kind of, mobile voice plans they had, Then the telecom company told that, yes, we certainly have access to that data. So they had access to data on how many customers do they have, whether those customers are from rural parts of the country or urban parts of the country, where do they stay basically? What was the data plan? What was your voice plan? Was it prepaid or postpaid and things of that kind? They had a lot of data. And given this data, we had to do some analytics. But the point that we are trying to understand here is difference between primary data and secondary data. The data which is already available with the telecom company, which you can readily go get access to, is called as secondary data source. This is the data which is collected beforehand. This data is collected and it is available for you to access. So it is easily available. It costs you less because it's there, already available. You can just take that. However, as a good data scientist, you need to also look outwards. One is obviously you go get the data from the client, from the company for whom you are doing a project. However, as a good data scientist, you start looking outwards. And that is exactly what we have done. What we have done is we try to get access to the various rural locations, to various villages. And the data which we tried to get access to was Google Images. Or rather Google Map Images. Say you have two villages, village A, and then say you have village B. In village A, suppose you had an uninterrupted water stream, river. And in village B, you do not have any water body, any river. What does that mean? Which village might be more prosperous? That village which has uninterrupted water supply. The more the water, people here might do a better cultivation. The crops here might yield you better results. So village A might be more prosperous. That's the first thought. Second, suppose the roads here are very structured. And in village B, the roads are very crooked. What indication does this give you? This gives you an indication that village A might be more prosperous. So the kind of 5G plan that I'm going to sell to village A would vary to the plans, 5G plans that you're going to sell to village B. And suppose you have huge buildings out here, big buildings. But then here, say you only have huts. You know for a fact that once again, this village A might be more prosperous. Big buildings mean maybe government schools, government hospitals, some kind of government establishments. Or maybe people are extremely rich, extremely prosperous. So the kind of 5G plans that you sell to A versus B would vary. When you massage your data, meaning when you try to get the data which is available with the client, and when you try to merge it with some open source data which is already available, or when you try to get any data which is already available, Google Map Images are already available. Just because you want to analyze the Google Map Google will not go and collect the data and give it to you. They already have it, right? All these are satellite images. So since you're taking the data which is already available, it would still be called as secondary data source. Secondary data sources are those data sources where data is collected beforehand and it is available for your analysis. Plus, what we have also done is we try to get drone images. We tried to get in touch with one of the drone startups, and this specific company told that, you know what, we already have the data pertaining to a lot of villages. However, we will not give away for free. Google Maps is for free, but we are a startup, so we're going to charge you. The moment they told we are going to charge you, that becomes syndicate data. Syndicate data is that data which will be sold. Data which is available for free is called as open source data. Okay, so we paid some money to this drone analytics company, and we got the data. What they do is, see, when it comes to satellite images might not give you very granular information on what crops are being cultivated here, what plantation is going on. To that extent, you would not be able to figure out by looking at Google Maps. However, when you fly drone usually is, flown at a lower altitude, not like satellites, right? At a very lower altitude. So it would go to the granular level and try to get the information on what kind of crops are being cultivated. And much to our surprise, in village B, marijuana, cocaine related plants were grown. Though they had huts, though the roads were crooked, though they did not have the uninterrupted water supply, the best part was they had access to marijuana, cocaine, right? So people in village B were actually more prosperous than people of village A. So our entire thought process changed now. Then we started figuring out that 5G services, better plans should be given to village B than village A. So the moment you keep combining the data given to you by a customer along with some other data which is publicly available, either it might be open source or it might be syndicate data. Ultimately, when you get access to all this, and when you combine the data from all these sources, and then when you analyze, your results will be outstanding, simply outstanding. And if the data is already available with either the drone analytics company or with Google or the customer, if the data is already available, that data source would be called as secondary data source. Since data is already available, you can easily go collect the data. Now let me give you yet another example here. We have done a project for a specific bank in USA. And this bank was specialized in providing education loan. This bank was specialized in providing education loan. Okay, and they already had a bunch of data scientists who were building the prediction models. But then they figured out that, you know what? When the model says that student who applied for the loan might not default, the students were actually defaulting. That means the predictions were not very accurate. gender of the student, which specialization would that student be pursuing, which college, so on and so forth. Given all this information, they built a prediction model. And then they approached us saying that, hey, can you do something else? Can you increase the accuracy of the models? I told you, yes, sure, certainly we can do that. And remember one thing, this data was data which is already available with the bank. They already had the information of who are the various students who have applied for the loan, which college did they go to, what was the specialization which they have pursued. They had access to entire data. What is this kind of data which is already available for your analysis called as secondary data source? Now, what we thought is, okay, the bunch of data scientists have done a good job by taking the secondary data, which is already available, and they've built a model on that. Good job. However, we thought that to add value, we need to get the data from external source. And we have created a mobile application. When we have actually built this mobile application, the approval, getting approval from Facebook was very simple, very easy, very straightforward. The moment you build a mobile application using Facebook developer apps, and when you submit it to Facebook, Facebook would by default approve that. Okay, I'll talk about another scenario later. And then, you know what, when you try to log in, sometimes you might see this, right? That you can log in using Facebook, or you can log in using LinkedIn, or you can log in using your Gmail account, as opposed to creating your own account. So what we have done is we have ensured that we left only one option, that is Facebook. We wanted people to log in only using your Facebook account. And the moment they log in, there would be a pop-up window which would appear, which would say that, you know what, we are going to scrape some data from your account, such as number of friends you have, what kind of comments are you posting. We want to scrape that information, is what you might think. And once we got access to that data, we started coming up with new variables, such as number of friends that you have. If a person has created Facebook account 3 years back, and if that person has probably only 20 friends, maybe this guy is secluded type. Would this person repay the loan? We don't know. We need to analyze. So that variable was important for us. We also try to extract the information on what kind of post was that person doing, right? Was that person always writing about sad things? Or was that person always writing about the good things? Or was that person, writing about some political events? So we try to get that kind of information. We also tracked information on whether this person frequently is traveling on international trips. If someone travels frequently on international trips, would that student, given a chance, would that student prioritize going on an international trip versus repaying the loan? We don't know. We need to analyze. And we also got information on whether someone is a gadget freak. iPhone 14 might be released on September 7th. Given a chance, this student who always posts about acquiring or purchasing new gadgets, would that student prioritize purchasing a gadget over repaying the loan or not? We don't know. We need to analyze. And that is exactly what we have done. The moment we have got access to this data, which was not already available. We had to build a mobile application. We had to scrape the data from Facebook by getting Facebook approval. Then the moment we got the comments or the posts that the person was doing, we had to do a lot of analytics to get emotions from that, to understand whether that person frequently goes on an international trip or not, whether that person is a gadget freak or not. We had to now go and get the data. The data which is not available, but you are now going and doing some research or doing some certain activities to get the data. That kind of data is called as primary data source. Primary data source. And that data which is already available. Bank already has the information on who are the various students who have applied for the loan. How many of them have repaid? How many of them did not repay? And bank already has that information. And if the data is already available with you for analysis, that is called as secondary data source. So you have primary data source, secondary data source. And when we build the model, we have achieved amazing results. Results were outstanding. So the point that you need to ponder upon is that don't just take the data which is given to you by a customer or client and start analyzing only based on that. Always try to get additional data from different data sources and then work on your project. When you mention about these things, when you work on live projects also, we expect you to do this kind of analysis and get access to the secondary data sources. When you put this kind of information on your resume, number one, interviewers will quickly shortlist your resume. Number two, when you talk about your projects with various stakeholders, including interviewers, they will simply be impressed because probably they became sick of listening to all these dummy projects. 99% of the people are just getting trained. They're working on some junk dummy projects and then they are applying for jobs. So interviews would be like, they would be sick. And don't assume that they cannot figure out whether you are genuine or fake. They can instantly figure out. So always, to become a successful data scientist, you need to work on the real world projects. Okay. And always you need to get access to additional data sources, combine the data, and then do your analysis on that. I'll give you yet another example, friends. And this another example is pertaining to the same Coca-Cola. I already spoke about a project that we have done for one of the leading beverages company. I think by now you know the name. Anyways, so what we have done there was, they have preforms, which is raw material, which is supplied to the blower unit. And within the blower unit, there were air pressure sensors. Okay, so they already had pressure sensors. These are called as IoT devices or industrial IoT devices, Internet of Things. Any equipment which transmits the data over internet is called as Internet of Things. And then there was also something called as a chiller unit where temperature was supposed to be maintained at a certain level, and they had temperature sensors. Then there were also height sensors in the filler unit. there were height sensors. And throughout there were sensors. But here in the filler unit, initially they did not have IoT sensor. The height sensor was not there. We have installed this industrial IoT sensor. Those devices which are already available would be generating data, and data was getting captured in the database. So you'll have multiple columns. Probably air pressure would be entered here every minute or every second. The temperature sensor would go into the second column every day, every hour, every second, whatever is the time horizon, you try to capture the data. And height sensors information wasn't captured because height sensors were not available. So now we have installed the height sensors. And when we install the height sensors now, we started capturing the data. So these two sensors, which were already installed, which was helping the company capture the data, would be called as secondary data sources, or data captured using these sensors, which are already available. Since data is already available, it's called as secondary data source. However, since we have now gone ahead and installed the height sensor, this is called as primary data source. So this IoT sensor is called as primary data source. So you have secondary data sources and then you have primary data sources. Now let's get into this discussion. Primary data source or primary data sources is data collected at source. You are now going and collecting the data. The surveys that you conduct, the experiments that you perform, the interviews, focus group sessions. Interviews means one-to-one interview. Focus group means you get group of people like HR department or sales department or logistics department, and then you interview them, you conduct some sessions, and then you try to get the data. You know, when you want to conduct surveys, if you receive a questionnaire which has, say, 20 questions, how keen would you be to fill that? Most people think that, oh, why should I fill this? What is in it for me? Why should I waste the time? These are the kind of thoughts that people would get. If you still want to go ahead and capture the data, what should you do? You need to this is called as blackout survey. Okay. If you still want to capture the data using surveys, what do? You incentivize the customers. How do you incentivize? You say that, you know, if you fill this specific survey, I'm going to pay you, you know, $20. Or you incentivize in some other manner, but then if you do not prove that there is something in it for them, people who are going to fill the surveys would rather not fill. And also any experiment that you want to perform, interviews that you want to conduct, or focus group sessions is going to cost you. So this is going to be a costly affair. Point number 2, it is also time consuming because you need to follow up once again. You know, you have to send out the questionnaires time and again, and you know, you want to probably you know, follow up with the customers multiple times to get the data. So it's time consuming. And usually when you fill the survey, what do? You'll be in a hurry. In that hurry, you might say A, B, C, 3, 4. I mean, you might randomly select certain options. So quality might be low. Quality might be low. And then what happens? Sorry. Oh, something has happened there. Sorry about that. Okay. However, the good part is that these two are the cons, disadvantages. This is the pro advantage, right? The advantage is that you can get access to the exact data that you want. If you feel that a specific variable is missing, then you can go and get access to that exact variable. And then we also have secondary data sources. As part of secondary data sources, we have both internal data sources and external data sources. Internal means, say you're doing a project for a customer. That customer might already have the data, their own sales data, their own enterprise resource planning data, ERP, or their own customer relationship management database, might have the data pertaining to their organization. Those are all called as internal data sources. You might also get access to external data sources such as industry reports, which is available, openly. You might have a lot of other open source databases. Those are all external data sources. Now try to relate this to the examples that I've given, the real world examples that I've quoted. The best part here is when it comes to secondary data sources, data is easily available and you'll have quick access to data. And the data is less costly. However, you might end up getting irrelevant data sometimes. You might get irrelevant data. Yeah. So you'll have to deal with that sometimes. Okay. So these are the various data sources. Now, if I were to go back to the mind map and then try to explain you more, there are two data sources, primary data sources and secondary data sources. You first try to get access to data, which is a secondary data source. You first try to get access to secondary data source because data is easily available. But the disadvantage is data may or may not have the variables of interest. If you do not have the data which is needed for your analysis, then you proceed further with primary data source. Primary data source is going and collecting the data now. Obviously, since you're going and collecting the data now, it would be costly and time consuming. But the good part is that you can go and get the data pertaining to the exact variable. Conducting the surveys, design of experiments, data simulation, web scraping, social media extraction, IoT sensors are all a few examples of primary data sources. But IoT sensors can sometimes be called as secondary data source because if the sensors are already installed and if they're already generating the data, that means data is already collected. If you're now going and setting an IoT sensor to collect the data, it is primary because you are now going and collecting the data which wasn't available before. Okay, you have certain additional things which you can always read, from the mind map. Okay. So now let's quickly understand on how a survey is conducted or how are experiments performed in terms of data collection. So whenever you want to conduct a survey, you first understand on what is the problem that you're trying to solve, for which you are collecting the data. But please remember that the business reality would be messy. For example, someone might say that, you know what, my sales are very low. This is a very messy scenario. A lot of companies have this problem. There is no silver bullet to solve this problem. So the reality of business problems is that business problems could be really messy. Okay. Once you get to know what is your business reality, you try to perform some kind of root cause analysis. There is something called as fishbone analysis, 5 why analysis, de Bono 6-hour thinking. There are a lot of techniques, or a simple brainstorming session with your team on what might be the reason for low sales. You might feel that, you know what, product line might be obsolete, or maybe the customer connect might be ineffective, or maybe the product pricing is uncompetitive. These could be the reasons on why your sales is low. For each of these root causes, you need to understand on what might be the decision that I need to take. Even before that, you need to ask questions on, should we launch new products? Because one of the root causes is product line is obsolete. If the product line is obsolete, does that mean we need to introduce new products? Customer connect is ineffective. Does that mean, we need to change the advertising campaign? Next, product pricing is uncompetitive. Does this mean product prices should be changed? We don't know, right? So we need to understand. Now, you need to do research to answer these questions. You have a decision problem on, should you launch new products? Okay. Or should the campaigns be changed? Or should the product pricing be changed? These are the questions, decision problems. You want to take a decision, but you have a problem on should you take that decision or not. For that, you need to do research. As part of research, you probably would say that, you know what, let us determine the customer preferences and their purchase intentions for the new product that we are trying to launch. Will they actually purchase or not? What kind of product should I launch for the customers to purchase, right? You might want to determine the effectiveness of the current advertising campaign before you decide on whether you need to change or not. You might want to determine the effectiveness of the current advertising campaign. Next. You might want to determine the price elasticity of demand and the impact on sales and profits of various levels of price changes. The moment we change the price, what will be the effect on the sales? And what will be the effect on the profits? Is something that you want to determine. In order to perform this research, you need to conduct surveys. So conducting a survey is not walk in the park. Look at what we have done. First, we understood what was the business reality. Then we try to identify what are the root causes for this. Then for each of those root causes, we try to understand, hey, what is the decision problem that we are facing here? And then we try to come up with research objectives for each of these decision problems. Then you come up with something called as constructs. If this is a training industry, let's look at training enrollments. So you think about some broad construct. Think about the trainer's quality, some broad construct, or trainer's qualification, another construct. Think about those. Constructs are usually multidimensional in nature. So these constructs are multidimensional in nature because training enrollment depends on various things. So you need to break the constructs into aspects. And these aspects are usually one-dimensional. Single-dimensional, like time-related aspect, strength-related aspect, constraint-related aspect. And for each of these aspects, you come up with survey questions. And for time-related, you can ask this question. I am most likely to enroll for the training program in next 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter, 6 months, can't say. That's the time-related question. Then you have strength-related. The one thing that most stops you for enrolling for the training is there is no urgent need, availability, price, so on and so forth. And sorry, my bad. So that's constraint related. And how sure are you about enrolling for the program? Absolutely sure, quite sure, somewhat sure, so on and so forth. These are strength related, questions. Once people answer to this question and this question and this question, you can combine the results of all these three aspects, and then that would help you get the answer for construct. You can add them up, or you can take an average of the responses, and then you get the response for the construct. Then for the research objective, then you take a decision for the root cause that you're trying to solve, which will ultimately help you address the business problem. Conducting surveys would be costly and time consuming. So the questions that you're going to ask should be well structured, well documented. Of course, this conducting survey in itself is an 8-hour session that we conduct, especially when it comes to modules such as customer analytics, marketing analytics, etc. For us, for data science, that depth is not needed. So at a high level, I've put together a picture for you all to understand the intensity and the effort which will go into devising the questions before you conduct a survey. Many things you do, basically, you try to understand whether these questions are well understood or not. So you test it with laypersons, and you also tease out the junk responses by introducing some kind of additional questions 2 times, and then see whether both the times they're answering to the questions correctly or not. A bunch of things exist. But that aside, this is how you conduct the survey for data collection. So this marks the end of this concept. In the next concept, we will talk about design of experiments, and then a few more stuff, and then we will get into data cleansing. We would be successfully completing phase 1 of CRISP MLQ.